All right. Yeah, I'm so glad you jumped in 10 minutes early, Diana, because that conversation was fantastic. So, anyway, as we have everyone dropping in to today's session of Connecting to Admired Leadership, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to attend live with us. As people are dropping in, just a couple housekeeping things and a couple things to express to everyone. We've been busy this year as we take the experience of these webinars, these short vitamins of leadership wisdom, I've heard somebody call them, on the road and meeting many of you in person. We've been in Chicago, in Miami, in Denver, in Philly. We'll be hosting our largest gathering to date in New York coming up on Tuesday. We have 89 people registered for that, which is exciting. And as I've been traveling around the country, I'm having folks come up to me and say, Wes, thank you for joining me on my morning walks. Wes, I appreciate you helping me mow the grass. Your coaches and partners are truly helping me focus and center on my way to work each morning. And at first I thought, what are you talking about? But then I'm reminded that our team is recording these sessions and putting them out there for folks to see. So if you don't know that, we have previous recordings, previous sessions. Many of you are listening to those right now. Sophie, if you would go ahead and drop those in the chat box for those who might like to look back at some of the sessions in the past, that would be great. So hello to those of you joining us live. Hello to those of you on your walk, your run, your yard work, your commute, whatever you're doing today. My final response to all that is I guarantee I'm getting more out of these sessions than anyone. I'm here for whatever series of events has led me to be able to spend time with our coaches, partners, and advisors. That there honestly is simply no greater joy than talking leadership with seasoned coaches like my guest today. So, as I introduce Diana, I'd love to know who's joining us live today. And it's always great to have some folks who join us live. We have huge registrations for these, of course, because the recording goes out afterwards. We get a lot of folks who just register to get the recording, but we always love it when we have folks here live. You can ask questions as we go along, share insights. So would love to know in the chat box. I already got some folks dropping that in. Who are you? Where are you from? And then today we're going to be talking about dilemmas and problems. So I want you to think of a dilemma or problem that you have in front of you, and I want you to rank that on a scale of 1 to 10. One being, my dilemma or problem is so minor that it's not even worth mentioning. 10 might be, this is a thing that is keeping me up at night and might very well make or break me right now. So who are you, where you're from, and then drop in there a score 1 to 10 of the dilemma problem that you're facing as well. So I typically introduce our guests, ask them a little bit about themselves and things. But today I wanted Alex to introduce you, Diana. So I think we're getting close to you being in the five timers club of being on our sessions, like we talked about, like from Saturday Night Live. So I asked Alex today, if you're not familiar with Alex, Alex is our executive AI coach that is becoming more and more robust, more and more just incredibly useful as we go along. So Alex says this, Diana is one of our partners at Admired Leadership who specializes in coaching leaders, teams, leading change, elevating performance, aligning support across complex organizations. She has over 20 years of professional experience advising on strategic communication, change management, executive visibility and presence, and stakeholder relationships. Her client list is very impressive, which it digs into that. We won't go into all that now. She has traveled to more than 60 countries and is fluent in Spanish and Korean. How did our AI executive coach do, Diana, in its introduction of you?
I think it did very well. I mean, I remember trying to put my bio together for our company website, and I think he outdid me, or it outdid me. So
I find that Alex tends to do that sometimes, is outdoing us at times. So let's jump right in. Sophie, if you would drop that Field Note into the chat box for everyone. If you are not a subscriber to Field Note, you can click on that, become a subscriber. Those are those daily leadership vitamins that come out via email. Really great, useful ways to start your day. And today we're talking specifically with the foundation of this Field Note that was written in regards to the difference between dilemmas and problems and kind of making that distinction. So, Diana, just start out and frame up the conversation for us, if you will.
Sure. I mean, I'll tell it in the vein of how I typically come across this in a coaching conversation. So if I am coaching somebody one-on-one, or maybe just giving advice as part of a larger project, one-to-one usually, with a senior leader or frankly anyone in the organization. And typically what'll come up is some analysis or some summary of a problem they're facing. It could be a problem that is tactical, something about deliverables, something about timelines, something about workloads, something about processes. It could be a problem that is political in nature. So even though we are inside in oftentimes for-profit organizations or nonprofit organizations, I use the word political with a lowercase p to indicate, there's a lot of people involved and there's a lot of selling and influencing that has to happen in order for things to get done. And so sometimes those are the problems that come up in that conversation. And other times it's really more structural problems, so resources or organizational reporting lines or things like that. And so often the first thing that I'll do is listen and digest, ask some good questions, just so I'm making sure that I understand the problem. But one of the key questions that I always end up asking, and it ends up being impactful to the coachee or the person involved, is this. Is this a problem or is it a dilemma?
Mm-hmm.
And usually the immediate question is, well, what's the difference, right? And I'll explain. It's not just about scale or how tough the problem is. Problems are things you can actually solve. Problems are things that you have either the control over it or influence over it, or you are directly, in line to help the people involved, the budget involved, the process involved, whatever it is, you have some degree of influence on it. So you can actually help solve this. Maybe it's not 100% your thing to solve. You still have to get people in line, but there's something you can do, and there's a group of people you can get involved, and that is something that is solvable. Dilemmas are things that, quite frankly, you can't. And even getting to a point of acknowledging that, actually, I find changes the entire conversation, right? So sometimes someone will sit back and be like, I am banging my head against this wall. And maybe something I have to just admit is I can't. And one of the things that often I encourage people to think about too is that a dilemma might be an immovable problem, a movable thing for right now. It doesn't mean it'll never be solvable. It just means that right now, given the situation, given the resources you have, given the support that you have in the organization, maybe it's a dilemma and not a problem. Maybe it's something you just have to either endure, work around, mitigate, live with, whatever the case may be, versus solve, at least right now.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a conversation recently with somebody who is really getting very agitated about a colleague of theirs. And this is someone who is a peer of theirs in the organization. They lead a large team as well, and their peer also leads a large team. Those teams are supposed to collaborate quite often, and the person and their peer roll up into the same boss. There have been a few incidences where there's been some territoriality, a lot of, pushback, perhaps needless pushback. And, obviously the first thing is that this person feels like there's a lot of, anger a little bit, irritation certainly, and quite frankly, a little resentment, starting to pile up. And so we started thinking, okay, so is this a problem or is it a dilemma? And some pieces of it are problems. Could we institute better working relationships? Do I need to reach out more? Do I need to build and invest into our, peer relationship? Absolutely. That's something you can help solve. But is this person going to go away? Probably not. Right? So
Right.
if you're sitting there stewing about how this person, how dare they be a leader in this organization, I don't understand how they got promoted, blah, blah, all of those things. I mean, quite frankly, that's the piece that's a dilemma. And maybe we just say, look, this person, until my coachee gets into a position where they can make all of the personnel decisions in their function, that other peer of theirs is there to stay, at least for right now. So let's figure out a way of how to deal with it. So kind of an interesting situation where understanding that some pieces of this was a dilemma that you have to live with, you have to learn to figure out what to do, and then understanding what smaller pieces in terms of at least outreach, building the relationship, investing time, in communicating with that other person. Those are problems that can be solved. was really helpful to kind of change the direction of that conversation.
That's really good. And you may have exhausted what we need to say about that, but I want to kind of have you dig a little bit deeper into how you really discern between a dilemma and a problem. What are some key things that you do as an advisor coach with clients, individuals, to help them first understand, is this a dilemma or a problem? And then what is the approach? The approach to a dilemma versus a problem is very different. And I know you just gave a case study, but anything additional? And as you think about that, I'd love if you're joining us live, and if you can, on the little drop down, make sure you're responding in the chat box to everyone. But I'd love for you to drop in there your dilemma or problem that you had in your head when you ranked it on that scale of 1 to 10. Drop in there if you believe it to be a dilemma or a problem based on how Diana kind of just made that distinction. Is it something to be managed as a dilemma, or is it something to be solved and it's a problem? So I'd love for you to make that as Diana digs deeper. So could you dig a little bit more into how does a leader make that distinction? How do we help leaders make that distinction? And what's the process of getting after a dilemma versus a problem once you've made that distinction?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably easier to think about what are the hallmarks of a dilemma, and then, if those hallmarks are there, then that's where it slots in. The rest of most of what we face are problems, or at least on the margins, are things that we can try to solve and try to address. I think the hallmarks of a dilemma are this. Number one, it is either 100% or 90% out of your control. There's very little that you can actually do about it. Do you have the final say, there? Do you even have an influence or a voice, in that, right? Whatever that is. So that's, number one, the clearest thing. The next thing I look for is, if you try to solve it, does it actually get worse? Is there a tail end to this that just continues and spins off? Because then it's a dilemma, right? You may think it's a problem, or a certain piece is a problem, but a good example is there could be lots of second order or third order consequences. So for instance, you try to intervene in something, and actually that creates a ripple effect where now those people are disengaged, or there's some backlash, or there's some resentment, or things like that. And then that'll actually affect other things in terms of what you're working with that team, or what you're trying to roll out. And so there's a cascading effect with that. So that in and of itself is, you may even want to think about it as a problem. I'm just looking at this piece of it and I really want to solve it. But if you took a step back, you'd be like, actually, no, this has a long tail, right? And I think if I start trying to solve this, actually, it's going to create this domino effect and a cascading effect that may actually worsen the situation. So that's the
Yeah.
second hallmark: is, does it have a long tail? Is there a cascading effect where, it could worsen the situation? And the third thing I think I look for is, how often are we really looking at the big picture, versus the small picture? So the hallmark of a dilemma is that when you do zoom out, you start seeing that there are tentacles. So it's not just about the tail, it's about how big is the scope of this thing that you're trying to resolve. And it's really tempting only to look at how things affect our team, our process, our role, our job, etc. And that's what we see. But you have to be able to zoom out. And if you do see that it spreads across more, that it's actually more of an endemic or a structural thing, then that's another indication that it could be a dilemma rather than a problem. So those three things are typically what I look for.
That's really, really good. Okay, so you just described what came to mind, Easter lunch with my wife's family this past Sunday, where my wife began to share a moment of intense fellowship that she and I had had earlier in the weekend. We don't have arguments at our house. Intense moment of fellowship where I had clearly done something wrong, and she's sharing this at the lunch table, and I feel like this is a problem to be solved, right? And so I engage in a way to solve this. And my sister-in-law leans over to me and says, "You are digging this hole much, much deeper than it needs to be." And I realize this is not a problem. This is simply a dilemma to be managed at this right now. And it is amazing to me how our not only our energy level about things at times, but also our way to attack things becomes completely different when we do identify problem versus dilemma. couple questions that came in ahead of time that I think are really practical and high utility. And if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat box. If you want to ask a question anonymously, feel free to just send that directly to the host or use the Q&A, because this can be, of course, quite the hot button of topics at time. But I think a couple good questions is, what advice do you give about how to move forward when a dilemma or problem is not solved? Because for some folks, coming out and saying this is a dilemma to be managed, it's never going to be solved, is going to send them on a tailspin. So how do you
Right.
manage that? And then as a leader, how do you keep momentum going when you've got a lot of dilemmas that you're trying to manage at the same time?
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes, it's obviously it depends on the relationship you have with the person, if that's the hypothetical scenario. I find that a healthy dose of teasing, but provocative teasing, sort of just challenging a
Mm,
little bit will be helpful. So sometimes what I do is I'll tease someone and say, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Pick one.
yeah, yeah,
This is
that's good.
dilemmas are those situations where if you try to be right, you're just not going to be effective.
Yeah,
Right?
that's good.
And it just like Easter lunch, if you just try to make your point and try to show everyone you're right, you're right, you're right, there's
That's
going to
right.
be lots of other consequences. That long tail we talked about, right?
That's right.
Um,
That tail
so
was so long, Diana. I had no idea.
it probably still comes up. It might even come up next Easter lunch. I'm
Oh,
just I'm
it's
just warning you right there.
years down the road. We're still, yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Do you remember the time when you said this in front of it? Absolutely. So, so that's one of the things I usually say is that sometimes, I mean, I would obviously love to live in a world where we are both right and effective all the time, and we could shoot for that. But
Yeah,
sometimes you have to make a choice.
yeah.
And asking the question, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? It can sometimes put someone in a mind space where they're like, okay, I understand what you're saying. I do have to let go of being right because that, quite frankly, is more about our own self-image, maybe a little bit of ego about, we
Hmm.
think this is the right thing to do. How does not it, how does everyone else not see this?
Yep.
Uh, versus what's actually best for the situation or for the team involved. So when you
Yeah.
think about effective, that actually takes you out of yourself. And then it's not just about you being right or wrong. It's actually about, okay, well, what do I need for the team? What do I need for the company?
Hmm.
What do I need for the clients or customers involved? You start thinking about everyone else instead of just, trying to get your viewpoint across. And then sometimes that can help, push you out of that and then realize, okay, all right, maybe this is something I do have to either let go or live with, or just quite frankly, learn how to mitigate, right? Its
Hmm.
effect on me and my team.
So, if you've listened to some of the sessions that Diana has been my guest on in the past, we've talked a lot about change. And so, this question I pulled out in particular because I think it has some elements related to hardships related to change, as well as honing in on kind of the dilemmas. So, a registrant asked, how do you push a team of seasoned professionals to realize what worked well in the past will likely need to be enhanced or changed? Seems like a classic dilemma between honoring experience and driving necessary change. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So this kind of spins off of, I think, the prior advice too, which is, what you don't want to do is go in there and telling them they're all wrong. Right?
Yeah.
That's probably the number one strategy of how not to affect change, how not to solve a problem or a dilemma, is to tell everyone they're wrong. I think, some of the things that we find is that it becomes a problem you can help solve once you involve people in it, right?
Mhm.
So not just me foisting my view, foisting my data, foisting my analysis on a group of people, but having them actually collect some, and do some really close look at the process or the way things are and evaluate what's working, what's not working, getting them involved. People are much more likely to come to terms with, yeah, maybe it's not perfect. There are some places we could be improving. They're much more likely to come to that conclusion if they are going through the process of collecting the data and looking at the
Yeah.
information, going through the analysis versus someone telling them that,
Yeah.
and telling them as a foregone conclusion. I think there's another piece too here where a lot of times, we talked about people taking problems or taking dilemmas as problems and not being able to let go. But sometimes the other issue is people take a problem as a dilemma and they just give up, right? And they're like, oh,
Hmm.
it's too big. We can't solve it.
Okay.
I actually think getting people on board or trying to work through resistance is not always the dilemma it looks like, right? That it
Mm,
could actually be a problem that's solvable. An example is this. So, if you think about you've got a lot of tenured people in that example that's been shared. Most of the time, their fundamental desire is just to hear some validation or recognition that they did good, they did good work, that it was
yep.
all for good reason, right? So a lot of times if there's a new leader or new change coming into town, then basically I'll coach people and say, you can't just only talk about the new legacy going forward, because that erases what everyone else has done so far. What you have to do is honor the legacy that's done, somehow talk about it in a way that because you did what you did, we're here now, which means now we can do even more. And so that's what we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do here is how do we incorporate what you've done, build on it, and then actually do something even more in the future. That's sort of a different way to frame and talk about it with people so that they understand that their legacy isn't being erased. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually trying to be incorporated and involved in whatever new legacy you're carrying forward. So
Oh,
those are ways that I think of that, change can seem like, especially with a resistant or a long tenured team, it can seem like a dilemma, but let's really try to, be creative about this and think about how we're pulling them along in, as part of the change.
so you said about five really great things, very practical things, high utility things in those last 5 minutes. One thing I picked up on is the difference in communicating for a leader, the difference in communicating when I've got a dilemma and what we're doing about that dilemma versus any difference in communicating a problem. And you mentioned some things in there, but anything come to mind? It's just a question that I thought of just now. Anything come to mind, best practices around a leader communicating a dilemma, communicating a problem? Is there any differences in how a leader might approach those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I find about teams, right, is that the good thing about teams is that when you're all high performing and you're pushing each other along, that can be a great environment. But if there's a sense of negativity or if there's a sense of demotivation, that then lots of people can pull each other down, right? And
Hmm.
so it's the role of the leader to try to keep an eye on that and see where they need to step in and hopefully change the tide, so to speak. I find that when teams run into dilemmas, they get demotivated very easily, very quickly, because it makes sense. Like who would sit there and go, this is a huge thing. We can't seem to get over or around it. We keep running up against it. Like who wouldn't sit there and say, "Ugh, what are we doing?" and not want to complain about it and not want to, talk about it again and again and again. So I think a leader's job is to look at that and be like, "Oh, you know what? Guys, this is a dilemma. Everyone, this is a dilemma. Let's figure out what we can live with, what we can tackle, what we can maybe even put a postage stamp or a push pin in and say, okay, if
Hmm.
our circumstances change, if the environment changes, this might be something that we can solve in the future. If and when that happens, we have our laundry list of things that immediately we'd go to try to fix that. Great,
Yeah.
let's get that documented. Now let's put that aside. And now let's refocus ourselves on what we can and can actually control. So I think that's really the piece that a leader brings into a situation is helping the team realize what is a dilemma, not in a let's give up way, but in a okay, well, let's put a pin in that for now because it is what it is, and let's figure out what we can do, right?
Hmm.
Maybe there are other problems we can solve. Maybe there
Hmm.
are subcomponents of what we're facing that we can actually solve, and getting them excited and engaged about what they actually can get involved in is usually the sign I think of a great leader versus an average leader.
So this next question may have you just repackaging some of the things that you've already said or bulleting them out a little bit, but I'm thinking of some of the problems and dilemmas, and we probably all are who are listening to this recording, where all of the different problems and dilemmas we have, we're thinking about them right now and already trying to separate them out. If I can itemize something as a problem, I like that a lot better because the measure of success is it gets solved, right? I can put a process in place to get there. What is the measure of success for a leader on working well through a dilemma? And again, you've hit around that quite a bit, but if I'm a leader, again, that's the reason it's so exhausting because it seems like there's no solution in sight. what are some things that I can communicate out or feel energy around that this dilemma, we are working through this appropriately? What are some measures of success there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we always have to remind ourselves, and I think someone in the chat also touched on this a little bit too, is that things always change,
Mhm.
unless we are in a role, a team that, I don't know, is something where you are a family-run enterprise where people are expecting that nothing will change for the next 30 years because you're going to be in that seat, running that enterprise until you drop over, like whatever it is. Even there will be some change. I'm trying to think of some example where there could be absolutely no change, but that's hard to find. There will be some change that happens either in your team or outside of your team or overall in the company or organization that you work with. And when that happens, circumstances change. That means the actual problems and dilemmas change.
Hmm.
So a lot of times what I'll say is that just because the answer is not yet
Hmm.
doesn't mean that it's never, right? So not yet could be the appropriate response for a dilemma. Right, not yet. We just don't have the ability to change this yet, right? Great. But that doesn't mean never. It doesn't mean no full stop. It just means not yet, right? So
Yeah.
let's put it aside and put our attention where we can for right now. And then again, we'll just keep an eye on things. And if things change, then great. I think Stephen mentioned, and sometimes those dilemmas resolve themselves. They just go
Yeah.
away because
Yeah.
circumstances change, and
Yeah.
so that's an amazing thing. Sometimes circumstances change so that now you can actually resolve and get involved and actually have influence over those things. So again, I think just even a helpful reframe as just think that as not yet. It's
Mm-hmm.
not no, it's not never. It's just not yet
That's
is helpful.
good. Yeah, I love Stevens from Baltimore, and I do love what he wrote there. If, the measure of success is nobody's talking about it anymore. It, if you realize you couldn't solve it, put it over here, put a pin in it. That's really, really good. So Diane, I'd love for you to have the opportunity just to kind of give any kind of last minute thoughts or encouragement to the leaders who are live with us today, or perhaps listening to this recording as well as you kind of gather some closing remarks for us there. If Sophie, if you would drop a couple more things, we have lots of course events coming up. We mentioned we've been in Chicago and Philly, be in New York coming up. Lots more coming up. Our kind of second round of those on location events where we're taking these great little leadership vitamins and trying to meet many of you out there across the nation. Be on the lookout for those on our events page. But specifically, we also have coming up a part two of a special webinar that we had. So kind of off of our regular sessions, we have a two-part webinars coming up around what we call the style code, which is a really interesting framework. It truly is a framework around elevating an individual's gravitas, executive presence in some ways. Sophie's going to drop in the chat box the first webinar, that recording, which was centered around why some leaders command the room and others don't. And then also, she'll drop in the chat box our next one that's coming up as well. This is one that you'd want to listen to the recording ahead of time. And then this part two would be a really great one to invite some colleagues to and those kind of things. This is a piece of our content that's actually been very meaningful to me in my career as well. So, want to pay special attention to those two things. And as always, for our live folks, we have the ability for you to schedule 10 minutes with one of our coaches. Maybe there's a specific dilemma problem that you have and you want to get some quick, bespoke, custom advice on those things. We have the ability for you to do that as well. And Sophie's dropping that link in the chat box too. Diana, final remarks, closing comments, encouragement for all of our listeners around problems and dilemmas.
Sure. One final thought that I'll share is this, which is that I have all the confidence in the world that everyone on this webinar, everyone in the extended admired leadership community could solve anything if you just had all the time in the world, enough resources, and if you had the energy to focus on it. It's not about whether you can solve problems or even dilemmas eventually, right? The question is, where do you want to allocate your time now,
Mm,
right? um, you're in a role, you're a leader, either formally or informally, because you're good at helping people get together or make decisions or, affect change or those kinds of things. That requires a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of focus, a lot of your internal resources. So I just really want you to think of yourself as a precious resource here, right? And
Yep.
not spend it in lots of different ways and just really
Yeah.
focus it on the places where you're going to get the biggest return on your investment, where you're going to actually move teams forward, where you're going to move other people in the organization forward. That's
Mm.
it. It's not that it's about whether you can solve the problem or not, or can solve eventually solve a dilemma or not. It's really about where do you want to put your time and focus and energy. And this is a quick and easy way for you to make that decision very, very easily in a day-to-day basis.
That's strong, Diana. That's really rich, practical way to frame about this. My personal takeaway when you're at lunch with your in-laws, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective, right? At the end of the day. And unfortunately, I've not always chosen the correct response to that as well. Diana, as always, appreciate the expertise you bring, just the passion that you bring, but just also the jovial nature that you always bring to these conversations and the rich practicality. Thanks to everyone who joined us live today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. And again, so I'm getting a few little things come in here. Just another piece there. Click on that link that says book time with a coach. So 10 minutes with a coach, and we can get any questions you need answered in relation to either our firm and how we operate or some of your specific circumstances that you have too. Would love to talk to you about that. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you all.